I keep telling myself I should have spoken up earlier. But then again, maybe everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. At 63 years old, I've come to believe that timing has its own kind of wisdom, even when it feels cruel. My name is Margaret Doyle, and for the past 4 years since my divorce was finalized, I've been learning how to take up space again. It's harder than it sounds. When you spend decades making yourself smaller so someone else can feel larger, the habit becomes part of you. You stop noticing you're doing it. You just keep shrinking until one day you look in the mirror and wonder where the woman you used to be has gone. I used to be someone who took chances. Back when I was 22, and fresh out of university in Halifax with a French literature degree and absolutely no sensible plan, I bought a one-way ticket to France. My mother thought I'd lost my mind. My father said nothing, which in his language meant the same thing. But I went anyway, because something in me needed to know what I was capable of when no one was watching. I ended up in Lyon, not Paris. Paris was for tourists and dreamers. Lyon was where real French life happened, messy and loud and extraordinary. I'd arrived meaning to stay 3 months, maybe practice the language, see some of the country, then come home and find a respectable job. I stayed 8 years. I learned French the way you can only learn a language when survival depends on it. Not from textbooks or apps, but from the woman at the morning market on Rue Auguste Comte, who sold me overripe peaches and corrected my grammar without being asked. From the regulars at the Bouchon where I waited tables for the first 2 years, men in their 60s who teased me mercilessly until my Lyonnais accent was better than passable. I didn't just learn the language. I learned the rhythm of it, the particular music of how people in Lyon speak, faster than Parisian French, more clipped, with its own slang and shortcuts that no classroom would ever teach you. Then I met Robert. He was a civil engineer from Hamilton, Ontario, in Lyon for 6 months on a consulting contract. We met at a terrible gallery opening I'd been dragged to by a colleague. He was standing in front of a painting that looked like someone had sneezed on a canvas, and he turned to me and said very quietly in English, "I have no idea what I'm looking at, and I suspect no one else does either." I laughed so hard the gallery owner glared at us. He extended his contract, then extended it again. When he finally had to go back to Canada, he asked me to come with him. I said yes. I packed up my little apartment near the Vieux Lyon and left behind that version of myself, the one who was fluent and adventurous and completely at home in a city that had once been completely foreign to her. I became Margaret Doyle, wife, then mother, then suburban woman in Ontario whose biggest adventure was finding a good farmer's market on a Saturday morning. My French stayed with me, but quietly. I read French novels, watched Québécois television sometimes, occasionally spoke to myself in French when I was alone in the garden, the way you might hum a song from another era of your life. But I never made a point of it. It wasn't relevant anymore, or so I told myself. Claire was born 2 years after we returned. She grew up knowing her mother had lived in France, but it was one of those vague family facts that children absorb without really registering, like knowing your grandparents were born somewhere else. Interesting in theory, completely abstract in practice. She never asked many questions about it. I never pushed the subject. The years in Lyon started to feel like something that had happened to a different person, someone braver and freer than the woman I'd gradually become. The divorce came after 31 years. I won't say it was a surprise exactly. Some things erode so slowly you don't notice the damage until the structure is already compromised. Robert had been distant for years, and I had been polite about it in that particularly Canadian way, not raising my voice, not making a scene, just quietly accepting less and less until there was almost nothing left to accept. When he told me he'd met someone else, I remember thinking that the strangest part was how unsurprised I felt. Claire was 30 by then, already established as a graphic designer in Toronto. She'd been in a relationship for 2 years with a man she'd met through work, a structural engineer named Luca Beaumont, French-Belgian on his father's side, born and raised in Brussels. She'd mentioned him often enough that I felt I knew him in outline, though I'd only met him twice before he proposed. He was quiet and careful in his speech, genuinely kind when he looked at my daughter, and that was enough for me. The engagement was in February. By May, Luca's parents had flown in from Brussels to meet our side of the family properly. His mother Helene and his father Philippe were spending 2 weeks in Canada, a few days in Toronto with Claire and Luca, then a weekend up at a rented cottage near Huntsville where we'd all gather together for the first time. Claire called me 3 weeks beforehand, excited and slightly nervous. Mom, I really want this to go well. Helene is lovely, but she's very particular. Philippe too. They're proud people, proud of their family and where they come from. I just want everyone to feel comfortable. I told her I would do my best. I genuinely meant it. What I didn't tell her was that I was quietly terrified. Not of Helene or Philippe, but of myself. 4 years out of a marriage, living alone in a too-quiet house in Guelph, I'd become profoundly uncertain about how I came across to people. Robert had spent the last decade of our marriage making small comments. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to but a slow, steady drip of suggestions that I was a bit much, or not quite enough, depending on the occasion. You absorb that kind of thing. It changes how you carry yourself, without you fully realizing it. I drove up to Huntsville on a Friday afternoon in late May. The cottage was beautiful, right on the water, the kind of place that costs more per weekend than most people's monthly groceries, but that Claire and Luca had insisted on because they wanted the setting to feel special. I arrived to find Luca already there, and Claire in the kitchen looking flushed and happy. Helene and Philippe had arrived an hour earlier. Helene came out to greet me as I was pulling my bag from the car. She was a tall woman, impeccably dressed even for a cottage weekend, pressed linen trousers, a silk blouse in pale gray, silver jewelry that was understated and clearly expensive. She air-kissed both my cheeks in the European manner and said, in English with a light accent, "Margaret, we have heard so much, welcome." Her smile was warm in the way that professional warmth is warm, technically present, not quite reaching the eyes. Philippe shook my hand firmly. He was a distinguished-looking man, silver-haired, the kind of person who seemed to have strong opinions about wine and expressed them without apology. He said something polite and gestured toward the cottage in a way that made me feel, irrationally, like a guest in a place Claire had rented with her own money. We had drinks on the deck before dinner. The evening light was doing extraordinary things to the lake, turning it copper and gold, and under other circumstances I think I would have found the whole scene deeply lovely. Instead, I sat slightly apart from the main group, nursing a glass of Ontario Riesling, and watching the conversation flow around me in that particular way it does when you're not quite part of it. Luca's parents spoke English well, but when they spoke to each other or occasionally to Luca, they shifted into French without seeming to notice they'd done it. It's a natural thing, falling into your first language with people who share it. I understood that. I sat quietly and listened and said nothing, and they had absolutely no reason to think I understood a single word. The first exchange I caught was between Helene and Philippe, while Claire had gone inside to check on the pasta and Luca was getting more drinks. They were speaking quickly, quietly, in the comfortable shorthand of a couple who has been together for a very long time. Hélène said, in French, that the cottage was charming, if perhaps a bit rustic for her taste. Philippe agreed, adding that Canadians had a particular fondness for that kind of thing, nature as a substitute for culture. It was dismissive, but not malicious. The kind of thing people say when they're not trying to be cruel, just being honest with each other in what they believe is privacy. I took a sip of my wine. Then Luca came back, and Hélène touched his arm and said, still in French, "She seems sweet, your Claire. A little simple in her tastes, maybe, but good-natured." She glanced toward the door where Claire had disappeared. "The important thing is that she makes you happy." Luca replied that Claire absolutely made him happy, and that he'd appreciate it if his mother didn't describe the woman he intended to marry as simple. Hélène waved a hand. I meant it as a compliment. Simple is honest. Simple is pure. I kept my face perfectly still. When Claire came back out and we moved inside for dinner, the seating arranged itself naturally in a way that placed me at one end of the table with Philippe, while Hélène, Luca, and Claire clustered at the other end in the easy intimacy of people who have already established their connection. The food was wonderful. Claire had cooked bœuf bourguignon from a recipe she'd been practicing for weeks, and she'd done it beautifully. Philippe complimented the meal with genuine warmth in English, then turned to me and asked politely about my work. I'd been teaching English at a private secondary school for 22 years. I'd recently retired. He nodded in the way that people nod when they're processing whether a piece of information is interesting or not, and have concluded it is not. Then he turned away and said something to Hélène in French across the table, low but not quite low enough. He said that he understood now why the daughter was a little unpolished. The mother seemed like a kind woman, but not someone who had ever really seen much of the world. I set down my fork very carefully on the edge of my plate. Helene replied in French that it wasn't a criticism. Plenty of people lived quiet, small lives and were perfectly content. It wasn't for everyone to have ambitions or curiosity or the courage to build something beyond the ordinary. She said it gently, the way you might observe that someone has plain taste in furniture. No malice intended. Just a verdict delivered in what she believed was a sealed room. Claire looked up from her conversation with Luca, catching something in the quality of the silence, even if she hadn't understood the words. "Everything okay down there?" "Wonderful," I said. "The wine is lovely." I reached for my glass. My hand was completely steady. I was quite proud of that. Philippe refilled his own glass and then, to Helene in French, said he only hoped that Luca wouldn't spend his married life having to carry the weight of a wife who had no real roots, no real cultural foundation. He wanted grandchildren with a sense of where they came from. I looked at him across the table. He was looking at Helene. Neither of them had any idea. I waited until Claire excused herself to bring out dessert, and Luca followed to help. Philippe was mid-sentence. Something about the importance of a strong family foundation for children when I said, in French, in the particular accent of someone who learned the language in Lyon and not in Brussels, but close enough that there was no mistaking it. "I think, Philippe, you might be underestimating the value of roots you can't see." The silence that followed was one of the most complete silences I have ever experienced. Philippe's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Helene's head turned toward me in slow motion. I looked back at them with the expression of someone who has been waiting politely for quite some time and has simply decided the wait is over. After a moment, Philippe said, in French very carefully, "You speak French." "I do," I said. "I lived in Lyon for 8 years. I learned the language there, not from a book. I apologize for not mentioning it sooner. I was curious what you really thought of us." Another silence. Then Helene said, barely above a whisper, "How much did you understand?" "Everything," I said. "From the comment about the cottage being rustic, to the observation about my daughter being simple, to the concern that your son might spend his life carrying a wife with no cultural foundation." I paused. "I want you to know that I'm not angry. I understand the impulse to speak honestly in what you believe is a private language. I've done it myself, in other rooms, in other years. But I think there are some things that need to be said now, before Claire comes back." I folded my hands on the table. My heart was hammering somewhere behind my ribs, but my voice was surprisingly level. My daughter is not simple, she is direct. There is a difference, and it is an important one. She says what she means because she was raised to believe that honesty is a form of respect. She is one of the most genuinely curious people I know. She reads widely. She travels when she can afford to. She has taught herself skills simply because she wanted to know how things worked. The fact that she doesn't perform sophistication the way you might be accustomed to doesn't mean it isn't there. Philippe opened his mouth. I held up one hand, gently. "I'm not finished. As for me, I did live a quiet life for many years. I was a wife, and then I was a mother, and then I was a teacher, and I poured myself into those things, and they were worth pouring myself into. But before all of that, I was 22 years old, and I moved to France alone with almost nothing, and I built a life there that would probably surprise you. I know Lyon the way you know Brussels, the streets, the people, the way the Sound looks in November. I worked in restaurants where the French I spoke wasn't good enough, and then I made it good enough. I left because I fell in love, and I stayed away because I was raising a family, and I let that chapter of my life go quiet because it seemed like the right thing to do at the time. I reached for my wine and took a small sip. I'm telling you this not to impress you. I'm telling you because you have formed a very firm opinion about my daughter and about me based on one evening, and that opinion is incomplete. Your son loves a woman who is honest and hardworking and genuinely kind, qualities that are not simple. They are rare. And I would very much appreciate it if, going forward, you extended her the same generosity of judgment that I am extending to you right now, instead of comparing her unfavorably to some standard she doesn't know she's being measured against." The sound of Claire's laughter from the kitchen drifted toward us. Luca said something in response, and she laughed again. That particular laugh she's had since she was 4 years old, fully inhabited, holding nothing back. Philippe set down his glass. Something had shifted in his expression, the careful, assessing look he'd been wearing all evening had softened into something more uncertain. He said in French quietly, "We have not been kind. Not entirely." "No," I agreed. Helene pressed both hands flat on the table. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. I owe your daughter one as well." She paused. 8 years in Lyon. Really? Really. I waited tables at a bouchon near the Presqu'île for 2 years before I got the teaching position I actually wanted. The owner was a man named Georges, who told me my French was appalling the first week, and passable by the 3rd month, and perfectly acceptable by Christmas. He was not a generous man with compliments. Something crossed Philippe's face then that I hadn't expected a smile. Not polite, but genuine. "Georges who?" I told him the name of the bouchon. His eyebrows went up. "We went there every time we passed through Lyon," he said. "In the 90s. A terrible man, Georges. Brilliant cook. He once told Helene her pronunciation of coq au vin was an insult to Burgundy." "He told me my pronunciation of everything was an insult to France in general," I said. We got along eventually. The tension in the room had not disappeared, but it had changed into something else. Something more careful and more honest. Luca and Claire came back with dessert, a tart tatin. Claire had been quietly panicking about all day and found the 3 of us in a silence that was different from the one they'd left. Claire looked at me with the slight narrowing of eyes that means she is trying to read a situation. "Everything okay?" "Yes," Helene said, and this time her warmth was different. Less professional. "Your mother was just telling us about Lyon." Claire blinked. "Mum's French?" She looked at me. I didn't know you actually. I mean, I knew you'd been to France, but I didn't realize you actually spoke." "Fluently," Philippe said. "In a Lyonnais accent that is, I have to say, quite good." Claire sat down slowly. "Mum." "I know. Why didn't you ever tell me? Like, actually tell me?" I thought about that for a moment. It was a real question that deserved a real answer. Because after your father and I divorced, I put a lot of things away. Things that felt like they belonged to a version of me that didn't quite fit anymore. And the French years were part of that. It felt like bragging about a life that had nothing to do with the one I was actually living. I paused. That was wrong, I think. Not just impractical, but wrong. I made myself smaller than I needed to be. And then I got so used to being small that I forgot I'd had a choice about it. Claire reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Helene said something to Philippe in French, low enough that it might have been private, and this time I chose not to relay it because it was actually private, an apology between a husband and wife for the assumptions they had made and the words they had let themselves say in front of someone they had wrongly believed could not understand. Some things deserve to stay where they belong. After dessert, Philippe asked me about the old quarter of Lyon, and we talked for nearly an hour, the markets, the travels, the way the city felt different from Paris, in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to miss. Helene told me about Brussels, about the neighborhood where Luca had grown up, about the bakery that had been on the corner for 40 years and had finally closed during the pandemic. Claire and Luca sat beside us and listened with the slightly stunned expressions of people hearing a language they knew their parents spoke, but had never heard them speak to each other. Late in the evening, when Luca had gone to get wood for the fireplace and Philippe had stepped outside for some air, Helene came and sat beside me on the couch. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the lake through the window. "I want to say something, and I want to say it properly," she said in English this time. "What I said about Claire, about her being simple. It was unfair and it was unkind, and I said it in French because I told myself it was between Philippe and me, not meant to be heard. But the intention doesn't change the content." She looked at me. She is clearly a wonderful woman. I was making judgments about things I didn't understand yet. I do that sometimes when I am nervous. It is not an admirable quality. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "It means something. Luca loves her. I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at her." She smiled, genuinely this time. "And if she has her mother's character, then we are gaining something very good." I didn't trust myself to say anything for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" Helene said. "Of course. Why didn't you say something earlier? You understood everything from the beginning of the evening. You could have stopped it much sooner." I thought about that, partly because I was trying to be polite. We Canadians are perhaps too committed to that particular habit. I smiled slightly. but partly because I have spent 4 years letting things go by that I should have spoken up about. I've been so afraid of being too much, too demanding, too present, too opinionated, that I became too little, and I'm tired of it. I'm 63 years old, and I've lived in Lyon, and raised a remarkable daughter and survived a difficult marriage with my sense of humor reasonably intact. I think it's time I stopped apologizing for being a person. Helene was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My grandmother used to say something. In French, it doesn't translate perfectly, but roughly a woman who has made herself invisible to keep the peace has given away the only thing that was truly hers. Your grandmother sounds like someone I would have liked. She was formidable." Helene looked out at the lake again. "You remind me a little of her, actually." Philippe came back in from outside, stamping his boots at the door, and glanced between us with the particular expression of a man who has walked into a conversation and correctly assessed that it is not for him. He went to find the whiskey. The evening wound down slowly, the way good evenings do. Claire made tea and Luca found a card game none of us were especially good at, and we played badly for an hour while the fire burned down. At some point Claire looked at me across the table with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in a long time, something between pride and wonder. The look she used to give me when she was 8 years old and I did something she hadn't expected. Before I drove back the next morning, Luca walked me to my car. He was quiet for a moment, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the lake. "I wanted to say thank you," he said, "for last night. For what you said about Claire. She didn't need me to defend her. She would have defended herself perfectly well if she'd known what was being said." "I know. But still." He paused. "My parents are good people. They just sometimes need a door opened before they can see what's on the other side." He looked at me. "You opened a door last night." "Your mother opened it herself," I said. "I just knocked." He laughed, and I liked the sound of it. On the drive home along the 400, with the Saturday morning traffic thinning out past Barrie, my phone sat in the cup holder lighting up with messages. Claire sending a string of texts that began with "Mom, you have been holding out on me for 30 years, and ended with a voice memo of her attempting to say something in French and getting it almost entirely wrong. Philippe sending a very formal, very sincere email, old-fashioned, I thought, and rather charming, apologizing properly and mentioning the name of a restaurant in Lyon that had opened in the old Tanner's Quarter, and that he thought I would find worthwhile if I ever found myself going back. And then one from Helene, short and direct, in French. "We would like you to come to Brussels before the wedding. Luca's grandmother is 91 and does not travel, but she should meet you. I think you would have things to say to each other. Please consider it." I read it twice, sitting in a Tim Hortons parking lot outside of Barrie, with a medium coffee going cold in my hand. Then I thought about the woman I'd been at 22, who had bought a one-way ticket to France with very little money and absolutely no guarantee of what would happen next. Who had learned a language in a city that had no patience for timidity. Who had understood, at some point in those 8 years, that the only way to take up space in a place that hadn't made room for you was to take it not aggressively, but steadily, as a simple matter of being present. I had spent 4 years trying to disappear, trying to be gracious about my own irrelevance, trying not to need things or want things or take up room that someone else might need. I was done with that. I texted Helene back, in French, and told her I would be delighted to come to Brussels. That I would like very much to meet Luca's grandmother, and that if she had recommendations for where to stay in the neighborhood, I would be grateful because I had not been to Europe in over 30 years, and I intended to do it properly. Her response came back in 3 minutes, a list of 3 hotels, ranked by preference, with brief and highly specific notes on each. I laughed out loud in the Tim Hortons parking lot, startling a man walking past with a box of Timbits. I sat there for another minute, looking at my phone, thinking about Lyon, about the market on Rue Auguste Comte, about the Bouchon where Georges had told me my French was an insult to France, and then, 2 years later without fanfare, had begun introducing me to customers as someone worth talking to. About the woman I had been before, I learned to be small. She hadn't gone anywhere, it turned out. She'd just been waiting, patiently, for me to stop pretending she was gone. I finished my coffee, pulled out of the parking lot, and drove home. I had a passport to renew and a suitcase to find, and a daughter who wanted her mother to teach her how to order food properly in French before the wedding. which gave me approximately 8 months to accomplish something I suspected was going to require significant patience on both our parts. I was already looking forward to it. I should have spoken up sooner, I know that. But I've come to believe that sooner wasn't something I was ready for yet. I needed to lose my way for a while before I could understand what I'd been walking away from. I needed 4 years of quiet and a dinner by a lake in Muskoka, and 2 Belgian strangers who didn't know I could hear them to finally say clearly, to myself and to anyone else who needed to know, I am still here. I have always been here. And I am not as small as I made myself believe.